All right, welcome to Study Group. Welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Derek.
Welcome, Kitty. Welcome, everyone at home. Today, we're going to be talking about the first humans on the planet, and as the Urantia book refers to them as Andon and Fonta. And this is actually a beautiful story where we learn about the personalities of the personalities that exhibited the traits of what we've grown to inherit in our own lives.
Yeah.
And some of the interesting stories that come along with these first two people and what they went through. And it should be interesting because it's a little mix of history, science, and
some drama.
Yeah. And it's been a while, so it's been nice to kind of unfold something like really heady like this. And it might not line up with science like we know, but yeah, this is the Urantia book, and this is a revelation, and some things are a little bit different than what we're used to, and that's why we're here to try to unfold some of this stuff.
Indeed.
So we get this story about Andon and Fonta, and we're going to learn a lot about it, and maybe we can just break down the timeline as we go through the show here.
Okay, sure. So here's the timeline that you can refer back to as we go along or later if you want referencing on the dates. But you can see this story we're going to tell today covers a huge range of time that begins all the way back with the original life implantation by the life carriers, carrying all the way down to the birth of the colored races. So the human races that we'll be talking about today are evolutionary races, as indicated by the title of the slide, in contrast to what we might call imported races that we've talked about in previous shows, like the Nodites and the Adamites, that they had superhuman origin. So they come into the story after what we talk about today. Right. So just keep that in mind. So these are evolutionary human races who still have, a presence on this planet. Very definitely, and it affects all of us. So this is like Derek was saying, this is a really fun and interesting story, and the character of these first human beings is really illuminated, and we can see how that lineage follows through into us today. So we're going to start. I'll talk about these dates maybe with the next slide, but it starts with the implantation of life on the planet, and after a long period of time, many millions of years, the North American lemurs emerged as an animal species on land. So that was a whole long process of going from marine plant life to marine animal life, and then finally to, the mammals that emerged much later. So these North American lemurs migrated to a region west of India that's now submerged, and in this region became an isolated peninsula because of geologic processes, which was a big advantage to this evolutionary process that was going on. So within this isolated region, the lemurs gave birth to the dawn mammals, and then the dawn mammals gave birth to the mid-mammals, and then the mid-mammals gave origin to the primates. And it was from the primates that the first human beings were born. And that gave rise to the Andonite race, what they call the Andonite race. And that name's, of course, derived from Andon and Fonta. And then, about 10,000 years later, there was the birth of Onagar, who was the first teacher of truth on this planet, the first revealer of higher truth and a hinting of the nature of God even. And then finally, we have the birth of the 6 colored races around 500,000 years ago in a highland region of India.
All right.
So going to the first
As you can see, this isn't going to be a quick podcast.
We've got a lot to cover, but we're going to try and do it as quick, as interestingly and efficiently as we can.
Yeah.
So bear with us.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So picking up the story here in a little more detail, we learn in the Urantia book, at least, that 550,000 years ago, the Life Carrier Corps returned to Urantia. Now, they say they returned because they had come earlier, around 600 million years ago, to assess the state of affairs on the planet, because they had to have the right conditions before they planted life. So they could tell they were getting close, just in terms of the geological development of the planet. So 550 million years ago, they returned. In cooperation with spiritual powers and superphysical forces, we organized and initiated the original life patterns of this world and planted them in the hospitable waters of the realm. We planted the primitive form of marine life in the sheltered tropic bays of the central seas of the east-west cleavage of the breaking up continental landmass. So just a couple of comments here. The idea here is that the land of this earth was originally a single continent, a huge continent separated by water on all sides. And at some point, this continental landmass began to break apart across the middle. So there was an east-west cleavage in this landmass. And it was in that cleavage area where there were these sheltered bays and inland lakes that provided the right opportunity to plant life. Now, the date here of 550 million years ago does not correspond to what is currently believed in scientific understanding about the origin of life on this planet. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot to that, and there's reasons that could be discussed about why there's this discrepancy. But just to know that we're aware of that, and have been kind of researching that to try and understand how maybe that came about. But that's too much to get into here.
Yeah.
But the idea here, like Derek was saying, we're telling a story here. Mm-hmm. So just go with the story. You can choose to believe it or not. But either way, it's a great story. And it gives us a sense of where we come from as human beings and all of that. So there's a lot of charm and value in this story, I think. So going to the next slide, this is just a image to kind of suggest what was going on. And they tell us that 450 million years ago, the transition from vegetable to animal life occurred. So this is sort of an image of what maybe these sheltered bays might have looked like where this process was going on. So going to the next slide. Now this gets a little bit, I don't know if philosophical is the right word, but it takes us in a direction that modern science doesn't usually go. So this can help to explain maybe a little bit of what's going on here. So let me just read these and then just a couple quick comments. So they tell us that it's the presence of the 7 adjutant mind spirits on the primitive worlds that conditions the course of organic evolution. And this explains why evolution is purposeful and not accidental. So in previous podcasts, we've talked about these adjutant mind spirits. So when all 7 are functioning, you have a full human being. But they become functional in stages as the life forms evolve. But they're telling us here that that mind has an influence on evolution. It's not just a process of random physical processes. So that's kind of a key conceptual piece in all of this. So in this next little bit, they say that mind is always creative. The mind endowment of an individual animal or mortal is always competent to produce a suitable and serviceable body for the living creature identity. So here again, we have this interaction of mind with body, that our bodies are not just an independent physical production of independent physical processes, but mind is involved in some way. And then they note that about 1 million years ago, the immediate ancestors of mankind made their appearance by 3 successive and sudden mutations stemming from the early stock of the lemur type of placental mammal. So that's what came up in that timeline slide. So let's go to the next slide. So this is carrying on with that part of the story where they say, slightly to the west of India, on land now underwater, and among the offspring of Asiatic migrants of the older North American lemur types, the dawn mammals suddenly appeared. In the 70th generation of this order of life, a new and higher group of animals slowly differentiated. These new mid-mammals, almost twice the size and height of their ancestors, and possessing proportionately increased brain power, had only well established themselves when the primates, the 3rd vital mutation, suddenly appeared. So here we're getting a sequence of purposeful mutations, that this life evolution that's being described here is in stages of sudden appearance, and it's all aiming toward the appearance of the first human beings, which they're telling us were a final mutation from the primates, which are almost human-like species. let's see. So here we're going to get a little more information about where this was happening. So if you can imagine, well, let me just read this and then maybe we can bring up a map.
Sure.
So with the passing of time, the seacoast of India, southwest of the mountains, gradually submerged, completely isolating the life of this region. So they're talking about this sort of peninsula region where all these mutations were happening. There was no avenue of approach to or escape from this Mesopotamian or Persian peninsula except to the north. And that was repeatedly cut off by the southern invasions of the glaciers. So I think what they're describing is a peninsula that kind of came down maybe from present-day Iran or Afghanistan.
Well, if we look at the map.
Yeah, go for it. So you have to kind of imagine geologically that the Mediterranean Sea was much expanded at that time, and they do make note of that. So that cleavage we talked about earlier extended all the way across the continent originally. It began to close in here and there, but there was still a large body of water.
Just so people know, the Mediterranean is over here where we see the first Eden. This is the Mediterranean. So at one point, it was all the way into the Persian Gulf.
Kind of more or less. Right. That's what they're suggesting.
So it bled into here. So the land topography was a little bit different, but you can see here that there is some things that were at one time above water.
So they're suggesting there was a peninsula that came down from the north, kind of where your cursor is, somewhere in there. And as you can see, if that was the case, it would be surrounded on three sides by water, which is what they're describing. But that they say that region has since submerged.
So you can see some of that stuff. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, right. So let me go on to the next one. They go on to explain that the primates, who was the species that gave origin to the first humans, but there were superior and inferior groups among these primates. So they say that the primates came to occupy a region on the west coast of the Mesopotamian peninsula. So they're talking about this peninsula that we've just been trying to describe that was adjacent to Mesopotamia. That's why they call it a Mesopotamian peninsula.
So if
as it then projected into the Southern Sea,
which would be like
Southern Sea would be like the Indian Ocean today, right? While the less intelligent and closely related tribes lived around the peninsula point, that would be the southern point of the peninsula, and up the eastern shoreline. So we just have to kind of imagine that.
Yeah, there's been some movement since.
Right, but the superior primates and the inferior primates kind of sorted themselves out in two different regions. And that's what allowed the superior primates to continue to evolve and eventually give rise to the first humans. So they comment that 1 million years ago, or approximately 1 million years ago, Urantia was registered as an inhabited world. A mutation within the stock of the progressing primates suddenly produced two primitive human beings, the actual ancestors of mankind. And that was a big deal.
That's what this show's about.
That's what we're getting to. So going on then to the next slide. From the year AD 1934, which was when the Urantia book was mostly written, back to the birth of the first two human beings is just 993,419 years. So approximately 1 million years ago. And here again, we have some discrepancies with what modern science has discovered, but this is getting a little closer. So this is in the kind of the Pleistocene era. And that's where the first human beings generally, it was during that time frame, give or take,
Which is 1 million BC to 500,000 BC?
Yeah, so in that period.
Right.
And that's the same period we're talking about today.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there is some correlation there.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, there's more to that, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so they say that these two remarkable creatures, these were the primates had given birth to, were true human beings. So this is a leap in evolution. This is what they call a suddenly. And the fact that there's these kinds of leaps in evolution explains why the in-betweens are never found. in terms of evolutionary theory. If it's not driven by purpose and mind, you expect to see all these gradations in between species, to produce the emergence of species. But here they're saying, no, that's not what really happens. These big leaps happen suddenly in one generation. So they're describing these first two human beings here that were born from primates, clearly a very different species. So there's a species leap here. It says they possessed perfect human thumbs, as had many of their ancestors, while they had just as perfect feet as the present-day human races. They were walkers and runners, not climbers. The grasping function of the big toe was absent, completely absent. When danger drove them to the treetops, they climbed just like the humans of today would.
Very interesting, because we always get these representations in modern science of, very hairy ape-like creatures being the first humans. But here the Urantia book is now saying that there was this leap from the primates right into the first humans. And there's just this this pair, these twins that popped up.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that great leap, then now modern humans started with, as you see, these phenotypes of what they're talking about, this genetic inheritance that we still have.
Yeah, they're not so different from us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so going to the next slide. The most remarkable, so there's more going on here than just physical evolution, which is what they're going to mention here in this slide. They say the most remarkable advance in emotional development was the sudden appearance of a new group of really human feelings. The worshipful group, embracing awe, reverence, humility, and even a primitive form of gratitude. Fear, joined with ignorance of natural phenomena, is about to give birth to primitive religion. So, in a couple of slides, we're going to pick up on this, but what they're talking about here is the emergence of human feelings that lead to worship. They talk about the worshipful group. Mm-hmm. So that's associated with the sixth adjutant mind spirit, which is the spirit of worship. Mm-hmm. So there's a hint here that adjutant is beginning to function.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, the next slide, we're going to do a little more description here. It says, these first two humans were so curious and adventurous that they nearly lost their lives on numerous occasions before they were 8 years old. Just can imagine. As it was, they were rather well scarred up by the time they were 12. So these are very active, curious little humans running around trying to figure out what's going on. They say very early, they learned to engage in verbal communication. By the age of 10, they had worked out an improved sign and word language of almost 600 ideas, and had greatly improved and expanded the crude communicative technique of their ancestors. So they're charging forward in leaps and bounds and leaving their primate ancestors behind. So in the next slide, they say, when about 9 years of age, they journeyed off down the river one bright day and held a momentous conference. Imagine these two 9-year-olds holding a momentous conference. Every celestial intelligence stationed on Urantia, including myself, which would be a life carrier, was present as an observer of the transactions of this noontide tryst. On this eventful day, they arrived at an understanding to live with and for each other. And this was the first of a series of such agreements which finally culminated in the decision to flee from their inferior animal associates and to journey northward, little knowing that they were thus to found the human race. So they're beginning to become so aware of their difference from their primate ancestors that they just realize they've got to go out on their own. And that was a huge decision on their part. So going to the next slide, they say, imagine our joy one day. The twins were about 10 years old when the spirit of worship made its first contact with the mind of the female twin, and shortly thereafter with the male. We knew that something closely akin to human mind was approaching culmination, and when, about a year later, they finally resolved, as a result of meditative thought and purposeful decision, to flee from home and journey north, Then did the spirit of wisdom begin to function on Urantia and in these two now recognized human minds. So the connection of the spirit of worship followed by the spirit of wisdom is the completion of the human mind potential. And we have those same 7 adjutants. So they're no different from us in that sense. But in their case, the contact with these adjutants happened in stages, happened gradually. I mean, the potential was there all along. The hardware platform, you might say, was there all along, in terms of their brain, nervous system, all of that. But it took some time for this to happen because this is the first time these adjutants had made contact on the planet with living, these are the first humans. So this is the beginning of it all.
Yeah, I think it's important for some of you guys who aren't aware of what adjutants are, check out some of the podcasts on adjutant mind spirits.
Right.
And then just to kind of simplify some of it, you'll see
that
they're engaging in worship and then eventually wisdom.
Right. So with the functioning of these two adjutants, we now had actual human beings living on this planet for the first time. Right. So this quote is telling us that Urantia was registered as an inhabited world when the first 2 human beings, the twins, Andon and Fonta, were 11 years old, and before they had become the parents of the firstborn of the second generation of actual human beings. So that happened a little bit later. Their vague feeling of being something more than mere animals was due to the possession of personality and was augmented by the indwelling presence of the thought adjusters. So this is a big concept in the Urantia book about personality. This is what distinguishes us from animals, that we have personality. Animals may have a lot of character and they have a kind of a will, sort of, but they don't have what, in the Urantia book's meaning of the term, personality. So this is how these 2 kids knew they were different from the animals. And after the completion of their mind potential, then the Spirit of God was able to come in and indwell their minds. So that's what they mean by the indwelling presence of the thought adjusters. So both of those, they knew they were not like their animal cousins. So going on to the next slide, they say that as youngsters, the twins had spent most of their time in each other's company. They preferred hanging out with each other compared to their animal ancestors. And for this reason, had never been overly popular with their animal cousins of the primates tribe. Nor had they improved their standing in the tribe by building a separate and very superior tree home. Some jealousy going on there, sounds like. And it was in this new home, among the treetops, one night, after they had been awakened by a violent storm, and as they held each other in fearful and fond embrace, that they finally and fully made up their minds to flee from the tribal habitat in the home treetops. And this next slide, you have an image of what maybe that looked like for them. Says they had already prepared a crude treetop retreat, some half day's journey to the north. This was their secret and safe hiding place for the first day away from the home forests. Going to the next slide. They sallied forth shortly before nightfall on their northern trek. While it required unusual courage for them to undertake this night journey, even with a full moon, they correctly concluded that they were less likely to be missed and pursued by their tribesmen and relatives, and they safely made their previously prepared rendezvous shortly after midnight. So you have to understand that they were, like their primates ancestors, were deathly afraid of the dark and the nighttime, because that's when predators would come out, other animals, and they would all go up to the treetops. For them to go out on foot at night was a big deal, but they did it. The full moon helped them, and they were correct that they would not be pursued. So they made their hiding place shortly after midnight. So then they say that as they journeyed northward, so they're on this northward trek. So they made their first night retreat, and then they had to continue to go north because they had to escape their relatives. So as they journeyed northward, the nights grew cooler and cooler. So keeping in mind, they're going toward the area where the glaciers were. No wonder it's getting colder. Already, they had been forced to make use of animal skins for warmth. Andon signified to his mate, to Fonta, that he thought he could make fire with flint. So they'd been collecting flint because they used it for weapons and other purposes, and it would often spark when these stones rubbed together, and he'd noticed that. So he thought he could make fire with flint. They tried for 2 months to utilize the flint spark for kindling a fire, but only met with failure. Finally, the secret of the technique was unraveled when it occurred to Fonta to climb a nearby tree and secure an abandoned bird's nest. Now here we have an image of what this might have looked like. The nest, this bird nest, was dry and highly inflammable and flared right up into a full blaze the moment the spark fell upon it. So this is a big, big moment of success.
Yeah, if you think about it, this is fire.
Fire.
The Here we talk about, the story of Prometheus and other things in our culture and folklore, but it's great that we get this opportunity to have a little story about this, these cute first humans figuring out. The female figures out that, maybe that nest might be. Yeah, right. Might spark it.
And then they go, boom. Let's try that.
Yeah.
So here they are. Well, they explain a little more in this next slide. They say that the primates' ancestors of Andon and Fonta, or Andon, had often replenished fire, which had been kindled by lightning. Fire that was just created accidentally by lightning. But never before had the creatures of Earth possessed a method for starting fire at will. They were so surprised and startled at their success that they almost lost the fire. But they saved it by the addition of suitable fuel, and then began the first search for firewood by the parents of all mankind.
Yeah, so in this interesting story is all these little firsts that some of us all partake in. Like the first time we go camping and you get sent out to go collect firewood, something like that. You get to connect with the ancestors, like why smoke smells so good from a campfire.
Yeah, why we just have a natural just kind of love for that type of experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's cute that there's an endearing quality with
connection going all the way back
of it.
Yeah. So in this next slide, we have an image of maybe what their fire looked like. You can see some firewood's been added here. And they comment that creating this fire was one of the most joyous moments in their short but eventful lives. All night long, they sat up watching their fire burn, vaguely realizing that they had made a discovery which would make it possible for them to defy climate. So this is a big deal. If they can create fire at will, then they can continue their journey into this northern, colder climate and be secure from their progenitors that they did not want to mix with.
Yeah, you can travel now, and you can bring security, warmth with you as you move.
Exactly. So this is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And say it's one of the most joyous moments in their short but eventful lives.
Mm.
So going on, they comment that it was almost 2 years from the night of the twins' departure from home before their first child was born. They named him Sontad, and Sontad was the first creature to be born on Urantia who was wrapped in protective coverings at the time of birth. The human race had begun. So animals don't wrap their newborns, but humans do. And humans are more vulnerable too, and that's the reason why that's necessary. And they realized that, and they did that. So they were the first to wrap an offspring in protective covering.
Mm.
Andon and Fonta had 19 children in all, and they lived to enjoy the association of almost 100 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. The family was domiciled in 4 adjoining rock shelters. So you kind of get a picture in the mind of what maybe that looked like. So that kind of completes our story of Andon and Fonta, but now we're going to move into the story of their offspring, who were the Andonite race.
Yeah, when we hear the name Andon, the male lineage of that is how they're describing this. So we have the Andonites.
Right.
And that's some of the traits that we've inherited, especially myself, I'm sure. Okay. So part of that is the Andonites had black eyes and a swarthy complexion. Something of a cross between yellow and red, which we'll get into later. In general appearance and skin color, these early Andonites more nearly resembled the present-day Eskimo than any other type of living human beings. They were the first creatures to use the skins of animals as protection against the cold. They had little more hair on their bodies than present-day humans. So it's really close to us. I mean, we could probably see some of our friends who have and ourselves who have a lot of Andonite inheritance.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Right? And that's these.
So these are not ape-like, like you were saying before. These look like human beings, just like we think of human beings today. But we will learn that their lineage gave rise to the Eskimo people, or what, I don't know if we're still allowed to use that term, but that's the,
Inuits, for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, that was the term in use at the time the book was written.
Okay. So they were a wonderful tribe. The males would fight heroically for the safety of their mates and their offspring. The females were affectionately devoted to their children. Many of the most noble and highly human traits of subsequent evolutionary development were touchingly foreshadowed in these primitive peoples. So again, some of these honorable traits that we exude to this day, we can thank our Andonite inheritance.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. And so, let's see. This next one.
It's the image.
Oh, my bad.
Yeah, going through the ice.
Okay. Bear with me, it's been a while. Okay. So then, these events occurred at about the time of the beginning of the third glacial advance. Thus, it may be seen that your early ancestors were born and bred in a stimulating, invigorating, and difficult environment. So this is where it's important, where we learn about how the elements play a role in the creative reserve and strength for the development of the human race, and how now we've inherited some of that.
Yeah, strength of character, willing to endure difficult situations. So they were early placed in the middle of those kind of conditions, which is a good thing, evolutionarily speaking, at least, even though they may not have enjoyed it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So before the extensive dispersion of the Andonic clans, a well-developed language had evolved from their early efforts to intercommunicate. This language continued to grow, and almost daily additions were made to it because of the new inventions and adaptations to environment, which were developed by these active, restless, and curious people. And this language became the word of Urantia, the tongue of the early human family. So this was the first language on this planet that was effective.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And they're saying that it grew very quickly.
Yeah.
Because these human minds were so curious and just creating new things every day that, almost daily additions were made to this language, which
you can see that. It's kind of like when a child is being born, or is born and then growing. They have new things in their environment that they're always having to label, right?
Right.
And new emotions and all these things that they're learning. So they're constantly they're going first. And that's what these were the newborns of our human race. So they were going first of labeling everything and giving it
or even with little kids, have imaginary friends. And they'll make up a language sometimes. I remember that with my kids. They'd say all kinds of crazy stuff. It meant something to them, but it was their own invented language because they see humans, making sounds with their mouths.
And if they're the only ones doing it, then that becomes the language. If your kids were the only
they might have invented their own language.
Yeah. If they were the only modern humans on the planet at that time, that new language would be the language of Urantia.
Right. It's funny to think about.
So as the Andonic dispersion extended, the cultural and spiritual status of the clans retrogressed for nearly 10,000 years, until the days of Onagar, who assumed the leadership of these tribes, brought peace among them, and for the first time led all of them in the worship of the breath giver to men and animals. So this is the first time that someone is actually started some kind of worship practice or worship, ceremony, and acknowledgement of deity.
Right. Conceptualizing something beyond human, the breath giver. That's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, and we even have a prayer of Anagar. The Urantia book is so kind of share a prayer right from this human himself.
Yeah.
And it says, "O breath of life, give us this day our daily food. Deliver us from the curse of the ice. Save us from our forest enemies. And with mercy, receive us into the great beyond." I find it cool, the similarities between this prayer and in the Lord's Prayer, where it's like, "Our Father who art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. Deliver us from trespasses."
Yeah, right. Interesting similarity.
Lead us not into temptation. But back then, their challenges were ice and forest enemies
and finding food.
Here we have our more internal challenges in modern man.
But there is this concept of the great beyond, that there is an afterlife. There's somewhere we go when we die. And the fact that he could grasp that concept.
Right.
And communicate it so effectively is pretty extraordinary if you think about it.
And then if he can communicate it, then there's other people who can grasp that concept too.
Exactly.
And so Anagar was born 983,323 years ago, from 1934, when the Urantia book was written. And he lived to be 69 years of age. It was pretty long for back then.
Yeah.
The record of the achievements of this mastermind and spiritual leader of the pre-planetary prince days is a thrilling recital of the organization of these primitive peoples into a real society. Never again, until the arrival of the planetary prince, was there such a high spiritual civilization on Earth. These simple people had a real, though primitive, religion. He sent out teachers to the remote settlements to spread his new doctrines of one deity and his concept of the hereafter, which he called the great beyond, or the afterlife. That's really advanced spiritual understanding that's flowing through this very early human, almost a million years ago.
I know. It's extraordinary.
And so Anagar instituted an efficient tribal government, the like of which was not attained by succeeding generations in many millenniums. That's pretty hardcore.
So this is just an image of what that might have looked like. Who knows?
It's like
but they're having a meeting, right? And he's sort of laying things down there.
Yeah. Well, they were using animal skins and whatnot.
Yeah, right. But the fact that they would actually have a meeting to talk about how they're going to govern themselves, I mean, that's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah. Advanced. Okay. So 950,000 years ago, the descendants of Andon and Fonta, who migrated far to the east and to the west,
had migrated
far to the east and to the west. To the west, they passed over Europe to France and England. In later times, they penetrated eastward as far as Java, where their bones were so recently found. This is back in 1934, where they were writing that. The so-called Java man and then journeyed on to Tasmania.
Right.
So there is some scientific findings that are correlating.
Kind of
with
correlating.
what was talking about there, right?
Right.
Okay. And then during the periods of the farthest glacial advance, the westernmost of the Andon tribes came very near being driven into the sea. So the glaciers...
These are the ones who had made it all the way to England.
Right.
In the west.
So the glaciers encroaching upon them and then pushing them into water where there's no more land to retreat to, right? So they're pushing them into the sea. They lived for years on a narrow southern strip of the present island of England. So there was a big Andonic inheritance coming from England. These repeated glacial advances drove them to take to the sea when the sixth and last glacier finally appeared. They built boats and started in search of new lands, and some of them reached Iceland, others Greenland, but the vast majority perished from hunger and thirst on the open sea. It's really interesting. You think about the inheritance of the English and how they came over here, came to America too.
Yeah, right. In boats, right?
In the boats. And here's their inheritance.
Yeah.
It's just kind of cool to think about.
Well, they'd say that they were the first mariners. They were the first humans to build boats and take to the sea. And you have to imagine the amount of courage it took to do that. Because, I mean, I guess they didn't have any choice. They're going to be driven into the water otherwise.
Isn't that such how life goes?
Yeah,
And
right.
Sometimes creativity needs such pressure to happen.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate that so many of our ancestors perished from starvation on the open seas. But that's part of the rigor that it takes for us to be able to be who we are now.
Exactly.
Well.
Yeah. I should also note that in the Urantia book, they talk about 6 glaciers. I think, and they comment that in our understanding, we only recognize 3 glacial periods. But in the Urantia book, they talk about 6 glacial periods, and this was the last one.
Okay.
So there's agreement about it being the last one, but as to the total number of glacial periods, there's some discrepancy.
Okay. A lot of notes here. Okay. So let's move on. A little more than 80,000 years ago, the freezing over of the North Seas and the advance of local ice fields on Greenland drove these Eskimo descendants of the Urantia Aborigines to seek a better land, a new home, and they were successful, safely crossing the narrow straits which then separated Greenland from the northeastern landmasses of North America. So just maybe a quick map.
Let's look at that on the map.
So they were coming up. Hold on, a little bit. So they were further up here. They're coming from England.
They went to England,
and then they came up
to Iceland,
up this way,
and then to Greenland,
and then into North America somewhere.
Right.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the slides, some people in Iceland and Greenland kind of look like some of those slides a little bit. And you look at maybe the Inuit facial. Right.
So here they're referring to Eskimo descendants of the Urantia Aborigines. So this is 80,000 years. So a lot of time has passed here. So during that stretch of time, the Andonites had begun to blend with other races. So they're referring to them as Aborigines, who are the Eskimos descended from. So essentially what they're saying is the Eskimos descended from the Andonites as they were mixed at that time with some other racial inputs.
So yeah, they're saying that's where Eskimos came from, which is very interesting because then we learn about other migrations later coming from the Bering Strait, coming from both sides. So that northern side of North America has seen some pretty unique action.
But those are remarkable people. I mean, I've seen videos and studies of, their history and their lifestyle, if you want to call it that.
Oh, people have no idea.
Yeah.
My best friend, he's married to a woman who's half Inuit in Alaska. Shout out Shane. But dude, it's unbelievable what those people can do up there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is. It really is.
Oh, man.
And how they survive.
Oh, man. Yeah, just like so.
And they actually like that. They like that climate.
Yeah, it's natural. Yeah, just the skilled, inherent understanding of the land and the inherent value of the lifestyle of knowing how to do things for yourself, pulling it from the earth.
Yeah.
Man, the resolve in those people. Awesome.
It's really something.
Okay. So hold on a second. Bear with me. So besides the people in the West, another struggling center of culture persisted in the East. So we just talked about the people in the West, Greenland.
The Andonites migrated west.
Yeah. So besides them, another struggling center of culture persisted in the East. This group was located in the foothills of the northwestern Indian highlands among the tribes of Badanon, a great-great-grandson of Andon. So that's pretty cool. This lineage of Andon into Badanon. And then we'll learn that Badanon was kind of influential here. So 500,000 years ago.
So we're backing up in time.
Right.
To pick up the story with the Eastern group.
Right. So we saw the advancement on the Western group. Now we're going back to Badanon over here in the East. And so the 500,000 years ago, the Badnan tribes became involved in a great racial struggle. For more than 100 years, this relentless warfare raged, and when the long fight was finished, only about 100 families were left. But these survivors were the most intelligent and desirable of all the then living descendants of Andon and Fonta. So there's a reason why they survived.
Mm-hmm.
They were more intelligent, and they had these desirable traits for survival, which we've thankfully inherited, but at the same time, it must have been quite a backslide for so many relatives to be fighting that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So the struggles of these early ages were characterized by courage, bravery, and even heroism. And we all regret that so many of those sterling and rugged traits of your early ancestors have been lost to the later day races. While we appreciate the value of many of the refinements of advancing civilization, we miss the magnificent persistency and superb devotion of your early ancestors, which oftentimes bordered on grandeur and sublimity. So there is this romanticism that even the writers of the Urantia book have for how intense it must have been, and how then how courageous these people stepped up to the challenges that were presented to them on this planet.
Right, and their heroism involved too, in preserving their families. Or you can imagine the ones that set off in those boats, where most of them died, but not all of them. So those are the kind of things they're talking about. But that's a really remarkable language, that these qualities oftentimes bordered on grandeur and sublimity. So, as I try to visualize these people, I keep that in mind, because these are not just apes. These are true humans.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's one of the psychological challenges that we have, is that we picture first modern humans as ape-like, but the Urantia book here is telling us that they leapt. There's an evolutionary leap from the primates. And so then there was a split where then primates evolved in a certain way, and then modern humans evolved in a certain way.
Right. So the humans didn't really evolve from apes.
Right.
There was a branching there.
Yeah. So humans did not evolve from apes. There was a leap and a branch, so that where humans then took their own path and primates took their path. Right.
They evolved from a common ancestor, but not a direct lineage.
Yeah. It wasn't this evolution from it.
Right.
And that can be controversial.
Sure.
Darwin's theory of
whatever. Yeah.
But nonetheless, this is what we're presenting here. So, and now among these highland Badnites, there was a new and strange occurrence. A man and woman living in the northeastern part of the then inhabited highland region. So we're talking about in India. And I'll show you the map later. A man and woman living in the northeast part of the then inhabited highland region began suddenly to produce a family of unusually intelligent children. This was the Sangik family, the ancestors of all of the 6 colored races on Urantia. Now, about this time, about 500,000 years ago, this is coinciding, and concurrent with the appearance of the 6 colored Sangik races, so happening around the same time, Kalagastya, the planetary prince, arrived on Urantia. Now, this is a big tease for everybody at home as to where we're going on our next podcast. But it's interesting that we look at, okay, 1 million years ago, we have the first humans, Andon and Fonta. And in this Pleistocene, we have we have now the Sangik races popping up at 500,000 BC. And this is then when Kalagastya shows up and founds the first, or establishes the first city on Urantia. Now you'll find that also kind of correlates to the stories of the Anunnaki and other historical representations of gods who dwell on Earth. So this is where we're kind of going with it. This is like the big tease, is that we have to get through this modern human. You'll start to see that there's this modern human growth that can receive certain guidance, not only mentally and physically or whatnot. And as soon as that happens, now deity is coming forward to build off evolution. Yeah, right. Upstep this.
So Caligastia was like a gift to the planet. He's a superhuman being who organized the first major city of Dalmatia, like you were saying. And he had a whole staff, and there was a lot of genetic repercussions that came out of that. I mean, his project ended up failing because of the rebellion, but it did go on for 300,000 years successfully. So this is, like you're saying, the origin of a lot of the oldest myths that we have on the planet are going to take origin from this arrival of Caligastia as our planetary prince. So the planetary prince is supposed to oversee human evolution all the way through to its final culmination in light and life. But that didn't get to happen here. But still, there was a lot of stories were generated, and a race came out of that too, which were the Nodites. Which
the Nephilim, as you might know.
Which we mentioned before.
So we're going to get into it. I didn't quite give you the last map thing. Let's just look at it real quick. So these were the Western Andonites, and then we're talking about Badnan, and we're coming over into India, somewhere maybe up in
kind of the foothills south of the Himalayas, I think is where they're talking about.
So somewhere in this region.
Somewhere in there. That. So that conflict that went on that reduced the Badnites to 100 families, at the same time, it produced the highest, the strongest of that race survived. And then they gave origin. This one family among those people gave origin to the colored races. So that was a huge advance now with the colored races.
As they said, a more intelligent group.
Yeah.
Children, 19 children in all. We're going to get in. We're going to touch on that. And then we're going to get into Dalmatia on the next podcast.
Right.
So bear with us if there's a little bit of break, because it's going to be a lot to go through, but nonetheless, it should be exciting.
Yeah. No, these are really fun and interesting.
Yeah. And I appreciate all your hard work, Chuck, as everybody else does. And please leave some comments or some questions. And hopefully we touched on some things and brought a new narrative to the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.